Thank you.
Let's get that a little bit higher for you there, sir. Excellent.
Thank you, Jeffrey Pearse, Commissioners, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm standing, I'm just got a brand new hip, so I'm enjoying that.
I hope it's a good.
Sorry?
It's a good one, is it?
I hope so. It looks all right at the moment. Thank you. But the Pearse family, and this is on written record, over 150 years ago, is the first European settler in our district, chose purposefully to live and farm next to the Opahi River. So as a family, we've had a long association with the river. It's been very much part of our lives. Certainly a member of our family has held a fishing licence for the last 50 years. I myself have caught 100 trout in a season, the majority in the Opahi River. One of my observations as a fisherman, and I only mention it, is that the flows in October, with the exception of this last year on restrictions, are generally too high for good fishing. We have under our umbrella 7 families whose livelihood are all dependent on the certainty of water in the river. So when I submit to you that we support the present minimum flows of the river and the role of OFRAG, I say so in what I believe is a purposeful position, and from someone who has a wide appreciation of the values, the ecology, the flows, and the nuances of the Opahi River. We possibly have a 3 to 4 kilometre boundary, and we're continually living and breathing the river. The OFRAG and minimum flows to date have served the community and the river very, very well. It has been a successful formula, and looking ahead with the impact of climate change and the potential volatility, it cannot be more stressed, not be more important that such a sound base is carried forward to maintain the values that we presently enjoy in the river. One must also respect the negotiated agreement 20 odd years ago between all the parties involved when the lake was established, or the dam was commissioned. Farmers were prepared to fund and buy into the project, understanding that half their water was for environmental values. And I do ask that that agreement is respected, because there's been a lot of financial investment and infrastructure, and now communities that are dependent on the integrity of that original agreement. My failing comment is that there is no doubt that should there be an empty lake, there are no winners. Thank you, Commissioners.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pearse. There may be one or two questions for you if you'd be inclined to wait for those.
Yeah, I'm still standing.
Splendid. I don't get the complete view. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Pearse?
Yes, I just want to clarify your position. The plan change 7 has notified, set out the current minimum flow regime for the Opahi. Then it had two steps of increases, one at 2025 and one at 2030. So which of those do you support?
Oh, you've got the Commissioner on detail. Look, I'm resting with the present flows as they are now.
Okay.
That's my bottom line.
So that'd be the current minimum flows that you're
Certainly,
dealing with.
certainly. But they've served us so well. They've been tested.
Yeah.
We've had issues, we've had dry periods, and it's worked.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Mr. Pearse, your final remark was one of interest to me. This was where you were reminding us of the arrangements that were made 20 odd years ago that led to the construction and commissioning of the dam. And you referred in perhaps a compact way to the nature of the agreement being that half the water would be used for environmental values. And you also brought to our attention what we readily understand, that financial investments have been made dependent on that arrangement. But 20 years is quite a long time, and sometimes a regional council finds that it's obliged to do things that it might not have anticipated it would need to do 20 years ago. And in particular, a council's legal obligations can change. Parliaments make new laws, governments make new policies, and so what was once acceptable and agreeable and everybody was happy with may no longer be permissible to the regional council. And I'm talking in general terms in the same way as you were. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond to that if you are inclined to.
Thank you, Commissioner. My only response is that if the decisions are community-based with the agreement of all stakeholders and risk takers, then that must be the weight of the day. But one must never forget that without those early contracts and agreements of understanding, there would be no dam. There would be low flows and a terrible biodiversity. So I do ask for balance.
And 20 years ago, asking for balance was indeed the fashion of the day. In the last few weeks, the Regional Council has been told that it is to give first priority to the health of the river, and the needs of out-of-stream users are not first priority. So it's not a matter of balancing, it's a matter of priorities.
Should
Are
I,
you aware of that?
if I were to respond to that then, and this is the point,
Please do.
if the river is the driver, and the Environment Canterbury has these guidelines put to it from government, requirements, the only way it can fulfil that obligation is by keeping the water in the lake. Because once the water's gone, all those requirements put Environment Canterbury in default. So I do ask you to understand that.
Well, Mr. Pearse, that was very good of you to give an answer to that question that was troubling me. I'm grateful to you for your attendance today, for the trouble that you've taken, and for responding to our questions.
Thank you.
This afternoon, the second item of our agenda is the submission of the Orari River Protection Group.
Commissioner Shepherd, we're still experiencing some technical difficulties. Could I suggest that we perhaps take a short intermission of maybe 10 minutes?
Yes, good idea. That's fine.
Okay, great.
Yes.
We can say public health position in Canterbury or not?
Just say public health.
Yeah, okay, no worries.
On the microphone and the camera now, and we're just about ready, and I can see Dr. Humphreys here. Just a moment. Good. Bye now. Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome. We've come to the submission of the Orari River Protection Group, and who is going to be the first speaker on their behalf?
Hello, Commissioner Shepherd and Commissioner Van Voorthausen and Commissioner Solomon. My name is Adele Coombs, and I'm from the Orari River Protection Group. I'm the current chairperson and have been so since 2016. And I would like to provide a brief overview of our group so that you know who we are, and then I would like to introduce some of the witnesses that are going to provide some material for you today. Will that be okay?
We're looking forward very much to that.
Okay. So the Orari River Protection Group has been active for 17 years, and we started in response to a dam proposal on the Orari River in 2003. We rallied community support because there was such high biodiversity and the water was such high quality, and we succeeded in stopping the dam quite quickly. We then got the Orari Gorge recognised as an area of high naturalness as a title in 2011 by Environment Canterbury, and this was a part of their land and water plan, and it was due to the clean water, outstanding native vegetation and biodiversity in the River Gorge. Then we worked with the community and many other organisations to develop the Orari River Integrated Catchment Management Plan in 2008. We have provided a copy of this electronically, but we have also brought a copy here. to the hearing if anyone wants to see it. We have had representation on the ECAN Water Zone Committee in our region from our group between 2008 and 2018, so 10 years of planning, but still we've not been able to have the integrated catchment management plan in active use. So that's one of our objectives, and I'll just digress for a moment to tell you what our objectives are as a group. They are to retain the gorge in its free-flowing state, to retain the integrity of the river hydrology, to sustain, protect and enhance the natural character and ecological values of the Orari River catchment for present and future generations, to maintain public access to the Orari River as an educational and recreational resource, to advocate for greater protection of the upper Orari River and the catchment in district and regional plans, and to recognise the potential for over-allocation and advocate for the use of the Orari River catchment management strategy. So now getting to some of our practical things. We're on the river often. We do lots of work. We do some biodiversity protection work in the gorge. We've done so for 5 years. It includes manual weed control and helicopter work with our funding partner, Environment Canterbury. Just in the last 4 years, we've done more than 1,100 manual hours. We target mainly gorse and broom to allow the native plants to flourish. In the gorge, we're also protecting rare native plants, including the pink flowering native broom, of which there are some up in the gorge. So we've been trapping predators for 9 years to protect the endangered wildlife on the river. There's 4 rare lizard species live up there, and you'll hear more about that from one of our presenters today, and also native forest birds in the gorge. There are also birds that nest on the braids of the river down below the gorge. There are endangered black-fronted terns and threatened black-billed gulls. And we scout and survey the river to locate breeding colonies. Then we conduct observations every week, and we maintain additional trap lines around the colonies because these birds are having trouble. They've declined in numbers drastically in the last several years. And in fact, the black-billed gulls are actually globally threatened. They're endemic to New Zealand. So we have a goal to make the Orari River predator-free, and we're engaging with more landholders along the river and maintaining 4 trap lines currently covering approximately 5 kilometres along the river. We also do some quarterly water testing with support from NIWA and from ECAN, and we found that the water in the gorge shows a level 1 NIWA category, but deteriorated water quality in the lower river with toxic formidium present, especially during months of low flow. We collaborate with other catchment groups, DOC, LINS, BRAID and ECAN, as well as landholders and community members in our work protecting the river. We also work with local contractors, Hobbs and Banks, and also Rooney's Earth Moving, and they help us do things to protect endangered birds. For example, last summer the water was drying up around a colony of black-billed gulls, and Rooney's Earth Moving, with collaboration with the ECAN engineer, they were able to direct some more flow down one side so the birds had more water to protect them from predators and provide food. So we like to engage with the community as a whole to hold events and fun days on the river as well, and we've been successful in obtaining grants from several organisations for our activities. And we continue to advocate for a healthy river, but downstream the Orari is degraded with water quality and quantity heavily impacted by high nitrates and over-allocation. So our group currently has 41 members this year, and a lot of them are quite active. And I would like to, with your permission, Commissioners, I would like to show you a short film that gives a summary and also a visual example of the things we do.
Thank you.
Okay. Do I need to do something else? A small river, but it's a valuable river nonetheless because of the state of its beautiful gorge. It's still relatively clean and free-flowing because the dam was stopped on the river. It's such a beautiful colour. People love to go and swim in its upper reaches.
This is my home area, and I have memories of going there as picnics with family to the bottom of the gorge and having some wonderful times. I don't remember catching fish, but there were definitely fish in the river, quite plentiful, and even as a teenager going there quite a lot to have fun. Yeah, it was great.
We need to work hard to have the gorge protected so that there's not more intensive farming there or more clearing or forestry, because that would disturb the catchment of the upper river. The biodiversity in the gorge of plants is just wonderful. We're doing a lot of weed control in the gorge as well. We are sometimes successful obtaining funding to engage helicopters to access hard to reach areas, to tackle gorse and broom and allow the native plants to flourish, but we also do manual weed control. There's so much amazing wildlife lives on the Orari. There are critically endangered birds that come and nest here in the spring and summer just on the gravel of islands in between the braids of water that flow. So we need to keep enough water flowing around them to protect them. We monitor and observe the colonies and watch the chicks progress and making it to fledging, and we trap predators around the colonies to protect them and give them more of a chance, but they are endangered by so many things, not just predators but also human impact of vehicles and dogs on the river during the spring and summer when they're nesting. We're also trapping predators all year round in the Orari Gorge to protect the biodiversity up there, the birds, rare lizards. You know, if you go through the gorge on a raft, you get to experience the specialness of the river. And we've done that a few times. It's an incredibly beautiful river and it needs protecting. It's worth protecting. Most of the rivers in Canterbury are unswimmable during hot months in summer when people want to go to the river because of high nitrate levels in the river or for medium toxic algae. And unfortunately, the lower reaches of the Orari are impacted by that, but the upper reaches are still relatively clean and accessible and swimmable, and people can still enjoy the river.
The Orari, we actually just recently were wondering what on earth does that mean in Māori, and so we looked it up and found it means provisions of fish, which is quite appropriate really, because I think earlier on it was a very valuable fishing resource, and yeah, even recently we've seen wonderful trout, etc. in the Orari.
So we'd really like the community to be really connected with this river, the whole community along the river, from farmers to town dwellers to people who love going fishing at the beach. We'd really love them to get on board and get involved and help us care for this river, because it's worth caring for. Thank you very much for watching our film.
Well, I do compliment you on the film. It's excellent. Thank you.
Okay. So from here, I would actually like to present or introduce Dr. Alistair Humphrey to you, who's going to speak to one of the points in our submission. But did you want to ask any questions about that before we ask Alistair to speak?
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions at this stage?
No questions yet, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, just one from me. Tangata Whenua, have they been involved?
They were at the beginning, when we stopped the dam. They got involved and helped us a lot, and were very, very valuable help to us. And I have visited them a few times since and spoken to them, but they are very busy at our local marae, and I think quite under-resourced and stretched to do all the things they really want to do. So, yeah, their time is limited.
Regardless, I think you're doing a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Keep it up. Thank you.
Okay. So Dr. Alistair Humphrey has travelled from Christchurch to present to us about nitrates. He needs to leave for a commitment, so he's going to speak about point 6 in our submission first, if that's okay with you. And Dr. Alistair Humphrey is a public health physician, and he's also on the Nitrates in Water research group in New Zealand. So here's Dr. Alistair Humphrey.
And are you also medical officer of health, Dr. Humphrey?
I am, yeah. But I think I should make it clear that here certainly in South Canterbury, the medical officer of health is Cheryl Brunton. I have let her know that I'm speaking on behalf of the Orari River Protection Group. So I'm not here to speak either on behalf of the District Health Board, whether South Canterbury or Canterbury, nor as medical officer of health. I'm here really providing technical information for the Orari River Protection Group, predominantly in my role as the nitrate in water, on the nitrate in water research group. The nitrate in water research group is led by Professor Michael Baker in Wellington. There are a number of people on the group. Mike Joy is associated with the group. Professor Ian Town, who is the chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Health, is also on that group. So I come here with the group's blessing, and I'm here really just to talk about nitrates.
Thank you. It's pertinent and we're very interested.
Now, I guess before I delve specifically into the issues, I should start my presentation, given that I'm here supporting a group that has a deep interest in ecology, to say that human health is very closely linked with our environment. You cannot separate the two. We are more closely linked, perhaps, than we would like to think we are. But there is no doubt that the health of our planet, the health of humans is actually dependent on the health of our planet, and not so much the other way round. And it is for this reason the Lancet now produces its own journals called Planetary Health. So when we are thinking about caring for human health, we need to think very carefully about caring for our environment. My initial involvement with nitrates was through the New Zealand drinking water standards and the risk of increasing nitrates in our groundwater through Canterbury, but also in other parts of the country. The standards set a nitrate nitrogen limit of 11.3, and it is at that point that small infants can and do die from a disease called methemoglobinemia. This level was set a very long time ago. It was a level that was set actually in the 50s, although some papers will allude to a second stage when it was re-established in the 90s, but it was set shortly after the Second World War because the Americans recognized a lot of babies were dying in the US from this disease, and as a consequence the level was set. It was quite a hard line in the sand. That is to say, babies died above this level, which was 50 milligrams nitrogen, as I say, 11.3 milligrams nitrate nitrogen. Below that level, babies did not die. Normally when you're setting maximum allowable values, you'll often have a margin of error that is set because tests will be carried out on animals, that kind of thing. But there was enough data back then to make a clear line that this was a safe level. It has become increasingly relevant here in New Zealand because although we have not had any deaths from methemoglobinemia, at least as far as we're aware, the levels of nitrate are steadily climbing in our groundwater, and they present a risk to pregnant mothers and their babies, particularly for people who have private bores. So community supplies generally are very closely monitored for nitrates. and they are safe. They have to be safe, but there are people who have private bores who certainly are consuming nitrates that have been climbing over the last 20 or 30 years or so. In order to protect people, because we have not been able, we have failed as a community to reduce the increasing nitrates in our groundwater, Canterbury District Health Board now have a system using health pathways in which lead maternity carers, that is GPs and midwives, are alerted to a level of risk in an area where a pregnant woman lives, and so that the midwife can provide information to that pregnant woman so that she can ensure that her baby remains safe even if there is a level of nitrate in the water. The way mums protect their babies in that case is to, where there's a risk from nitrates, is to breastfeed their babies. Nitrates are not transmitted through breast milk. Or alternatively, if they cannot breastfeed their babies, they have to have a separate water supply, usually bottled water. So that's something we've had to do, and that's very much what you might call the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. But I'm pleased to say that as a community now we are beginning to take our source water supply a lot more seriously. We have to do this, and it's become more important since evidence has accumulated that methemoglobinemia, which is a very rare syndrome, is not the only thing we should be concerned about. A recent study from Denmark by Jørg Schullener of 2.7 million Danes, it was the whole country was looked at, identified that at relatively low levels of nitrate, there is an attributable risk for colorectal cancer. This was a very good study. It was, not only was it a large study, but it accounted for those other confounders that can also cause colorectal cancer. So we are well aware that there are other risk factors for colorectal cancer, such as alcohol consumption, such as obesity, such as red meat consumption. But this specifically looked at drinking water in Denmark. There were a number of advantages in Denmark, that is particularly that people are not as mobile there as in some other countries. Also that they consume water from the tap, so they don't drink as much bottled water perhaps as some other countries do. So the risk was clearly identified as being nitrates in the drinking water. I had contacted Jørg shortly after this and asked whether or not he felt that Denmark would reduce the maximum allowable value for nitrates as a consequence of his research. So while he had advocated for this, he said that this was unlikely to happen because as a global community, we collect evidence from more, despite the fact this was a very good study, we need to look across the whole world. So there have been other studies. There was a study in Spain that looked at the same thing. There have been one or two derivative studies in the US. But Jørg was particularly interested in what we might do in New Zealand. And why was that? Well, he knew from his expert research that New Zealand had high and increasing levels of nitrates in our groundwater. He also knew, sadly, that we have one of the highest rates of colorectal cancer in the world. So this is research that needed to be carried out. As a consequence, Ian Town and Michael Baker, myself and others have started this research group where we are looking at the association between nitrates and colorectal cancer in New Zealand. We have to date produced, we've supported a researcher called Jane Richards who carried out a master's thesis on this issue. And Jane did some excellent work here where she built up a nitrate database looking at levels of nitrate across the whole of New Zealand and was able to look at the potential effects of this nitrate on colorectal cancer in our country. And I hope you've had the opportunity to look at the executive summary of her
Yes.
work.
We do have that, yes, and thank you for allowing Ms. Coombe to provide it to us.
So the important thing I think to recognise here is that if we derive the risk from those other studies,
I apologise, but I must interrupt you for a moment.
This is testing only.
There's going to be an oral interruption because of a fire alarm testing. It's not a fire, it's just a testing, but it might distract me from what you're saying. So if you'll forgive me, Dr. Humphreys, I'd ask if you'll just pause for a moment till that's over. Surely that's all they'll need.
okay?
Attention, the building's fire alarm testing is now complete. Please acknowledge any further tones. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Humphreys. Continue about Dr. Richards or Miss Richards' thesis.
Right. So as I was saying, Jane Richards collected data on known levels of nitrates across the country. The issue here, which we recognise as a research group, is that those people likely to be most vulnerable, that is to say those with the highest levels of nitrate, were the least likely to be on a community supply where there were regular, monitoring of nitrates. So the community supplies, by and large, are well maintained, have low levels of nitrates, and where we find higher levels of nitrates, a supplier is obligated to change the source of their water. In order to make some kind of estimate of how many unregistered supplies would have nitrates in them, she looked across Southland and was able to show that amongst unregistered supplies, levels of nitrate are higher. So that if that is taken into consideration, and if the data from the other international studies are taken as a potential source of colorectal cancer in New Zealand, there could be up to 800,000 New Zealanders who are currently being exposed to nitrates, which put them at some risk of colorectal cancer. There are some people who might say, well, so what? These people choose to drink alcohol, these people choose to eat red meat, which also puts them at risk. But actually, we don't have a choice where we get our drinking water. This is something that is a fundamental human right. So we are not able, we could become a vegetarian and reduce our risk, but we could not stop drinking water. So it's important data. Finally, she looked at the association between colorectal cancer and high levels of nitrate across the country. And sadly, particularly in South Canterbury and Canterbury, we do have high rates of colorectal cancer here. So what she was able to do was corroborate the Danish study. Her data does not confirm the Danish study at this stage, and in order to do so, we would need to carry out further case control studies, which she recommends at the end of her research. But they support the position that Jörg Schullener and his colleagues found in Denmark. So, in summary, we know that nitrates can cause very serious problems for small babies. That's a small but significant risk. When it comes to colorectal cancer, where we have some of the highest rates in the world, the risk is much, much more significant, because there are many New Zealanders who die from colorectal cancer, and we need to ensure that the nitrate levels are kept as low as possible, given the increasing body of evidence that shows that our levels perhaps are at 11.3 are too high for completely safe drinking water consumption. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Dr. Humphreys?
It's just in terms of the work that you and your group are doing, what's the likely time frame for that to have an actual impact on New Zealand's drinking water standards?
As I said before, it's going to take some time. There will be other research taking place across the rest of the world. We don't pretend that our research on its own is going to change the minds of IARC, which is the International Agency for Research into Cancer. I suspect that those maximum allowable values may take a few more years, and we will take our lead from the World Health Organization and from IARC. Just like Denmark, we will not unilaterally change our maximum allowable value. However, what we can do is ensure that our levels of nitrates, we can apply the precautionary principle as a community to ensure that our nitrate levels do not continue to rise, as we know they have done, particularly in Canterbury. Obviously, the data goes to the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, and that level of nitrate has continued to rise for the last 12 years or so. It has not come down. It's not even flattened off. So I guess in short, yes, we'll wait for our guide, so it could be a few years. But in the meantime, let's be precautionary.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Question for Dr. Humphreys. How realistic is it that zone committees will take on board what you've said about drinking water standards when the zone committees are made up by community members? I mean, that's why it hasn't changed. And I don't quite know whether it should be up to the zone committees to initiate change. It should be a government change.
I agree there needs to be leadership from the top here. And, I think David Parker has done a good job. And I think protecting our source water has now become a fundamental principle which perhaps was not as clearly articulated previously. But I think we still, at a local level, continue to do our work to try and explain the issues to our zone committees. I would say that none of us probably know anybody. There are a few perhaps anecdotal stories of methemoglobinemia, but many of us know people who have suffered from and die from colorectal cancer. That's a very real, it makes a difference when you know people. It's a bit like COVID in some ways. If you don't know anybody that's had COVID, it's easy to think it might be some kind of elaborate conspiracy. But when you know people who have been affected by it, it brings it home to you. Now, as I said before, there are many risks for colorectal cancer, but it's a common disease in this country, and it's a very common disease in these parts around Timaru. So I hope our zone committees take note of that and think about the research that we're trying to build.
And has this information gone to all 10 zone committees and the regional zone committee?
It has not at this stage.
Okay. That's all from me, thanks.
Sure.
Doctor, there was something I was not clear about when I went to the drinking water standards, which I have a copy on my screen at the moment. I think it's a fairly up-to-date version of it. But I got myself a bit confused, and I'm sure you've got a much deeper knowledge of this instrument than I have. But as well as the maximum acceptable value that you've been explaining to us, the 11.3, there seemed to be some suggestion further on in the document that it was acceptable for a source of drinking water to have half of that. Have I misunderstood that?
The time for action, that is to say, if a supplier is delivering water and the level of nitrates reaches half the MAV, they are obliged to act at that point.
At half the MAV.
Yes, and the reason for that is it's a bit like turning an oil tanker around. It takes a long time, as the Canterbury Water Management Strategy knows, to turn around increasing nitrates. So suppliers are obliged to act at half the value, half the MAV.
Well, I'm very grateful for that. That's helped me to understand what I was trying to read. Dr. Humphreys, you've helped us in the past, and we're grateful that you've come again to help us once more. And we appreciate your expertise in public health, and thank you for the trouble you've taken.
You're very welcome.
Now, Ms. Coombe, who would you like to go to next?
Okay, I would like to come back to point number 1 and speak to our first point in our submission. And I just have a few comments. I don't want to read through. I assume you've all got the reports that we've sent in as part of our
Yes. I was going to go through a list with you, but I don't think I need. We've got 4 reports that you've referred to, and we have them in text in front of us.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much for taking the time, Commissioners, to look over all that information. I've just got a few comments to make about those reports. So the current IUCN red list of endangered native freshwater fish shows that 11 are threatened. And in our understanding of the current proposed Plan Change 7, the only water bodies that are going to be listed as protected or mapped, if you like, as habitats are those habitats of those 11 threatened fish on the red list. But I feel like saying that further reports since then, since that red list was made, have shown that 39 of our 51 native fish species are threatened or declining. Dr. Mike Joy reported on the significant rates in decline in recent years, recording the biggest declines were in bluegill bully, lamprey, short jaw, giant cockapoo, black flounder and torrent fish. 2 of these species are in the Orari River, according to the scientific studies we have provided to you. So if we continue to operate things this way for a further number of years, then we could stand to lose more native fish and further freshwater species to become threatened. And I would just like to say, personally, I feel strongly about this, that humans might be able to negotiate and give and take in making their living. But it's becoming really obvious that these vulnerable creatures aren't. They can't with the pressure that we've put on them. And their survival depends on us to do things differently and to do this sooner rather than later. So we would like to ask you to help to draw up this plan in a way that creates a win-win. I know it's a big task for you as commissioners, but can you try to create a win-win for the health of the environment as well as for the health of the economy? And as Dr. Alistair Humphrey has just pointed out, that will also be a win-win for the health of the humans as well.
You? Now, how would you like to proceed in terms of the rest of your case? Is there anything more that you would like to have someone address, or?
Yes, we have some more people here to give evidence.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Who's the next?
We would like to speak about point 2 now, and we have Drew Brown who's going to help me present evidence for this point. In this submission point, we asked for the consents on the Orari River to be reviewed immediately and to introduce a higher minimum flow and a reduction in over-allocation. And I'll just introduce the point by saying that the report that we provided by Golder and Associates, they recommend 1.5 cumex as a naturalised mean annual flow, or 1,496 litres per second, for the wildlife living on the river. And they mention those wildlife, those native fish that I mentioned. The Orari River is currently over-allocated and has been for years, and we would like to see this adjusted as soon as possible to allow ecological flows in the Orari. We would also like to see the Plan Change 7 achieve a protected ecological flow much sooner than the dates in the plan, which could risk the survival of so many of our native fish and birds that are unable to speak for themselves here today. Living on the Orari River are endangered black-fronted terns, nationally and globally threatened black-billed gulls, rapidly declining blue-gilled bullies, Canterbury galaxids, torrent fish and koaro. In our work protecting colonies of black-fronted terns and black-billed gulls on the Orari, for the last 3-4 summers we have observed that the river braids are drying up before the chicks are raised to fledging in December and January. So we really need to bring back more water in the river. And black-billed gulls are New Zealand's most threatened bird and is the most threatened species in the world, with numbers declined by 80% in recent years. We can't afford to give and take and compromise the existence of these birds that are only endemic to New Zealand. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce Drew Brown, who's going to talk about the Orari River Integrated Catchment Management Plan.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Drew Brown. I've been a member of the Orari River Protection Group since its foundation.
Mr. Brown, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your first name. Just give it to me again.
Drew. It's short for Andrew.
Thank you very much. Yes.
We feel that the Orari Integrated Catchment Management Strategy, the plan, should be included within the Land and Water Regional Plan. And to validate this request, I hope that this short presentation would emphasise the group's dedication to the consultation process that we've been through in the last 20 years. And the results of that process has really, we feel, provided the foundation for the objectives for sustainability for managing this river. Integrating it, its ecological, and social, economic and cultural values. As you've heard from Adele, the history of the Integrated Catchment Management Strategy goes back to 2003, when our group was formed to fight the proposal for a dam. There were a series of meetings that resulted from that, community meetings, and as you could probably imagine, there was quite a bit of controversy, and the community was beginning to split and over such issues. And very wisely, ECAN proposed hosting information meetings that all groups could attend, and these meetings were very successful. There were over 30 presentations and 6 workshops, and those workshops and presentations have been listed and I believe sent to you. And they also are listed on the back of the integrated management strategy that we have here, and it's also been presented to you. these included a wide range of documented research highlighting hydrology, which is surface and aquifer, geomorphology, ecology, flora and fauna, economic, recreational and educational use and benefits. The ECAN also coordinated for us a series of workshops to create a draft plan, and in 2005 asked all interested parties who were attending to select a steering group to fine-tune the management strategy as well as set time limits and priorities. Members of the steering group were elected, and they included representatives from Tangata Whenua, our group, Rangitata South, the damming group, recreationists, farmers, industry representatives, educationalists, and concerned community members. All meetings of the steering group were open to the public and were organised and coordinated by ECAN bi-monthly. So over a long period of time and a lot of work, the resulting mission statement of the ICMS became to sustainably manage the Orari River catchment, integrating its ecological, social, economic and cultural values. I'm sure you've already seen the goals listed for this ICMS. I can go through them, but I don't want to.
Indeed, we have the document
Good.
that you're
Okay.
reading
Thank
from.
you.
I'm following it on the screen.
Okay, thanks. So rather than go through them one by one, you can see that the goals were itemised, three itemised goals, and for each goal there were objectives, each of which had a matrix of action, responsibility, priority and timeline. In other words, this was a working document for work, progress to be done to be created on the river. The steering group, by the way, also produced an Orari River Code of Behaviour for all users. The ICMS was produced as a non-statutory document and was presented to the community in a very large meeting in March 2008 and was put to the community and was formally accepted resoundingly and unanimously by the community. In essence, really, the core values of the ICMS have been, I guess, adopted by the Orari Opihi Temeko Para River Implementation Addendum and the 2012 Zone Implementation Program in Part B. Really, its vision and recommendations within the compass of its 6 main considerations were really drawn out of that document. However, the action statements and requirements of that strategy have never been taken up, even though it was accepted by the community. And that's why we would like to see it at last be included in the Land and Water Regional Plan. It's there, the work's been done on it, and it has the approval of the community. So we feel that our group's contribution to the final result has been considerable, and we do feel it validates our group's crucial part in the ongoing determination of any management plan for the river and any changes thereof.
Well, compliments to you, Mr. Brown, for all of that. Let's see if there's any questions from my colleagues about it. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, so just in terms of the overall presentation, is this the right time to ask about your request regarding minimum flows, or is that going to be another speaker?
I think I talked about minimum flows under point 2, so you can ask about that now if you wish.
Okay. So just before I do that, to the officers, the Orari Freshwater Management Unit minimum flows has the recorder site in table 14H. It's called Upstream Happy. Where is that in relation to either State Highway 1 or State Highway 79? I'm trying to find out where it is on the map.
It's at the bottom of the catchment. below State Highway
So
1.
it's below State Highway 1. That's where the minimum flow side is. Okay. So I've just been looking, previously read through the Golders report that you attached as part of your submission. And my reading of the summary of that report, section 6, is that for downstream of State Highway 1, a minimum flow of 0.9 cubic metres per second is recommended as providing protecting native fish values, salmon spawning habitat, brown trout rearing and spawning habitat. That's 900 litres per second. And I note that that's the minimum flow that table 14H for the Orari looks to bring in at 2040. So I was just wondering how all that relates to what you've said in your submission regarding a much higher flow of 1491, I think.
Yes, well, Commissioner Vorthausen, I did read that they recommended a protected ecological flow of, 1,496 mean annual low flow. So I don't know, it's MALF, M-A-L-F. So I'm not sure if that's the same figure you're looking at. Is it a M-A-L-F?
No, I know what a MALF is.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in the report do you derive your number from?
It was from the recommendations.
Do you have a specific page or section
Yeah,
reference?
I don't have that in front of me, I'm sorry.
No, you don't? Okay, then. All right, no further questions on that then, thanks.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have it's an observation. I can understand you've gone to all this work and got the community on board to develop a great strategy, but now it's implementing it, and it's always the way with strategies and management plan, it's the implementation. That's getting the strategy completed is just step one, but implementing it. So with that in mind, because you want these provisions to be implemented through PC7, did you talk to ECAN a long time ago when they were first developing up PC7 about any of the provisions?
Yes, if I could answer this question, Commissioner, we did present about our integrated catchment management strategy to the Zone Committee, and they did include, I understand they did include a recommendation to follow this in their draft zipper, if you like. You know what I mean when I refer to
Yes.
that? Yes, but it hasn't made its way into Plan Change 7.
So was the Orari steering group, or the Orari, or the community, the people that put the strategy together, were they one of the groups that were consulted when PC7 was first developed?
No.
Okay. I don't have any more questions, but thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Coog. Do we now go to another presenter, another witness?
Shortly, if that's all right. We would like to speak to you about point 4 in our submission now. And, my apologies, point 3. I have something to say, just a few comments about the principle of te mana o te wai. In point 3 of our submission, we asked for the Orari Gorge to be recognised as an area of high naturalness and protected across the whole catchment. We understand that in the forming of the draft zipper and the proposed Plan Change 7, that our Zone Committee had a meeting for a full day to discuss what area of high naturalness would protect. And we understand at the end of their full day of consulting, they decided that they would just protect the water only. But I want to really point out to you that the principle of te mana o te wai recognises the whole of a river catchment, not just the water. This principle recognises that the land use around a sensitive catchment also impacts on the water and the creatures that live on the water. And we would like to suggest that the principle of te mana o te wai include the whole catchment of a sensitive water body like the Upper Orari, and that the integrity of the river also includes the land use for the haora, or the health of the whole water body. So this area of high naturalness in the upper Orari has interconnected habitats and species, and we would like to ask you to include that in the proposed Plan Change 7, a protection measure for the upper river for land use, not just for the water. And yes, now I would like to introduce Dr. Bruce Allen, who's going to give evidence or present evidence to you to talk about care of the upper Orari catchment.
Good afternoon, Dr. Allen.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, and thank you for this opportunity. I have given background to my background to my involvement or life involvement in tussock grasslands, and also as a member of the Orari River Protection Group since its inception in 2003. And what our chair Adele has just mentioned about the whole upper catchment, that is where I want to spend briefly some time on the fact that it is has a history of low intensification, and because of this we were able and argued for the highest naturalness state in 2011, and this from our point of view definitely includes the entire catchment, not just the river. And it is really the whole emphasis of my technical and experience that I'm presenting here is really around maintaining this high naturalness further into the future. So I wanted to talk specifically, firstly, about tall tussock, and that this really was the dominant vegetation of the upper Orari. And just as a memory I have, as an example, that at much lower altitude there was dominance in tall tussock. Just on the road between Geraldine and Fairley, and after the Skipton Bridge on the right, there was a remnant of tall tussock 20 to 30 years ago, magnificent remnant at low altitude, which unfortunately is now gone. The tall tussock has regressed back to higher altitude, and I have a plea that it is regarded more, or has a similar status to our indigenous forests, and these tussocks are actually long-lived and recover very slowly, and once gone are very, very hard to replace. They are unique retainers of water, and I have used or referred to Tim Davey from Landcare Research, who did a review of all the hydrological aspects of tall tussock, and that review is a very good paper that outlines the unique ability of tall tussock and associated indigenous vegetation to retain water in a catchment. Whereas if it was modified to improve pasture or exotic forest, the actual evapotranspiration loss from that would be much greater. So the tall tussock is a valuable regulator and retainer of water, providing higher and constant yield to further down the catchment. And for this reason, let alone its landscape value issues, it should be retained. Going beyond tall tussock, the remaining areas have had a history, as I said, of low intensification. This has involved mostly strategic cultivation and, in some cases, irrigation to support strategic feed supply to the farm operations, and in addition, oversowing and top dressing of the shorter tussock country in a way that actually has largely maintained and kept the values of that area. I would argue that there should be some limitations on considering development of those oversown and top dressed areas. And just, I used a second reference to point out that recovery from depleted and overgrazed areas such as this is possible, provided there is reduction in grazing and also control of things like weed and pests, particularly wilding pines and rabbits. That's Susan Walker's work from the Botany Department of Dunedin University. The big concern, I guess, we have is the threat that high input intensification to these areas can produce, and the associated technical and infrastructure that goes with that. And I'm referring mainly to land use change to dairying and forestry. And this is where there's an opportunity through zone committees, but also district councils and particularly Crown lease land control to actually regulate some of these activities. I would argue there are no-go areas outside the strategic cultivation areas that I talked about. So on the bigger picture, there shouldn't really be any further abstraction from the Orari, upper Orari, to allow for large-scale irrigation. There should be no nitrogen or blanket nitrogen use on these areas. And there also should be no blanket herbicide use, which has become relatively popular for developing these areas with the cheaper glyphosate technical that's become technically available now, economically a means of improving these areas. And I'd just make a plea that through this regulation, and it's been made before by us today, that environment is considered first over economics, and that that there should be a mindset by the land users of this area that environment is critical, and that I believe, with my experience in high country agriculture, that it is possible to have both conservation and production in these areas. And just to comment that the tenure review process does a disservice to this because it separates production from conservation. I believe they should work together with the mindset of stewardship of the land. And so we'd certainly make a plea, as I said at the beginning, that from the point of view of downstream of the gorge and all the problems there with over allocation and nitrate issues, that at least the upper gorge is upper flows from the upper gorge is maintained in its present state and of high naturalness. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Allen, and thank you for presenting the whole document that you've been giving us the summary of, and I've been following your complete text as you've gone through it.
Okay.
Thank you. Any questions of Dr. Allen, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, you referred to land use activities in the upper catchment, and in your verbal presentation you mentioned District Council, albeit briefly. The Mackenzie District Council has a plan change 18 on biodiversity protection. Is your group involved with that?
Not that I'm aware, but no.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Allen. At your paragraph 11, do domestic animals or sheep graze on native tussocks?
Sorry, can you repeat the
Do domestic animals or sheep graze on native tussocks?
Yes, they do. They can be a relatively important part of their feed supply, and on short tussocks they can graze, and they can short tussocks can depending on the number of species, there are 4 different species dominantly of short tussock. They can respond differently, but they do survive and sustain themselves under that well-managed oversun and top-dressed area.
Does that include tall tussocks?
Sheep?
Yes.
Yes, it does to a limited extent, and I've made the comment that these areas must be managed, and this is again an issue with production, conservation, separation, that the separation into conservation sometimes overlooks the fact that a small amount of grazing, lower controlled levels of grazing, could actually be beneficial to particularly weed and grass and fire risk. Yes.
In your paragraph 14, you talk about top dressing, oversowing and top dressing. Top dressing of what?
Of the short tussock, using fertiliser.
Right.
And I'm using mainly superphosphate, and because if the low fertility of this area can be improved by adding phosphate and sulphur.
Right.
And then the nitrogen comes through introduction of clovers. So the phosphate and sulphur is generally added by sulphur fortified superphosphate. I would argue that it should be added by natural phosphate, rock phosphate, ideally. But I think this is acceptable in a low input level.
So does top dressing of superphosphate, is that good for tussocks?
Yes, it helps tussocks. But it mainly helps the whole biodiversity, which includes indigenous and exotic introduced species. So the indigenous vegetation, including tussocks, if well managed, can be maintained in that type of development, which helps maintain the values that we're arguing for.
Okay. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Allen. Appreciate the trouble you took in preparing the complete document and for your skill in giving us this summary that you've gone through just now. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
So, Commissioners, I would like to speak about a few more points before we finish our presentation to you this afternoon. One of the points is point 7, and I'll be very brief here, but I would just like to ask that you could note that you have now received the coordinates of the swimming areas in the upper Orari River, which is used, because they were not included in the proposed Plan Change 7. They were struck out because, and in our submission we had not provided the coordinates, so they're here now. And, yes. And I would just like to say that if you talk to the landowners at Orari Gorge Station, that swimming area is heavily used in the summer. Hundreds of people go up there and use it. And we have been up there on several occasions, a very memorable occasion, rafting down the river with our group. We had a filmmaker with us making a film about the specialness of the Orari River, and there were cows in the river and urinating in the river right near the swimming hole, and that's why we would like to ask that you include the upper area to be protected and for stock to be excluded, because you can often go and see cow manure beside the river right there in that area, and I think that's important.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we would like to speak to point 7 in our submission. Oh, sorry. I would like to invite Drew Brown to speak about also recreational use under point 7 on the Orari River.
Yeah, thank you. I'd really like to talk about the not only recreational but also the educational values of the river. In terms of recreation, I'm sure you have my outline there that for a very long time, over many generations, as Adele alluded to, There have been areas of the river that have been extremely well used and with large numbers for, as I said, for generations. Indeed, when we had our first meetings, when we formed the Orari River Protection Group, there were literally hundreds of people who were horrified that their families would not be able to carry on the tradition of going to those particular areas. Fisherfolk have used the very lowest stretches of the Orari, although fishing now has become more difficult there because of the degrading quality of the water. But fishing upstream of the gorge is particularly well known for expert fly fishermen, and even fishing guides fly in clients into that area. Kayakers and rafters take their opportunities when they can, the right river flows, and this is purely a grade 2 section. It's ideal for beginners and intermediate kayakers, and is very popular. All users have expressed their love of the extremely clear and clean water that comes through the gorge, and particularly those places. In terms of education, I should say that my background has been as an outdoor education teacher at Geraldine High School. I taught outdoor education for 25 years and started courses, and also I was chair of the Peel Forest Outdoor Centre 25 years. I should also mention that I've retired from that position, and Dr. Allen has taken over my position as chair. So we both have a lot of knowledge of the use in terms of education of that area. Geraldine High School has been the main secondary school education provider using the river, and I would say, and I think there has been a list provided of some facts, incomplete facts, I'm sorry to say, we didn't keep very good records after a certain time, of our use as a school of the Orari River. We have literally put thousands of young people through outdoor skills in that area: kayaking, river safety, river crossing, environmental studies in that area, primarily because it's safe, it's clean, and it lends itself to education opportunities in the best sort of ways. Peel Forest Outdoor Centre has also and still uses this area, as does Geraldine High School. And once again, they must have introduced thousands of people, young people, into that area over the last 25 years. I started the Outdoor Ed course at Geraldine High School in 1990, and Peel Forest Outdoor Centre started in 1994. And we have a long association and history of using that area as an educational resource. It has become an extremely valued resource for parents who know that their children go to a clean and safe area. Having clean, swimmable water in this part of the river is a health risk management issue that providers must take into account when considering taking students into that particular environment. This is a very specific and vital issue that we feel that needs to be regulated by a form of protection of the upper catchment, which provides that clean water, and we feel that high naturalness would be such protection. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you. That adds a further area of interest for us. Now, Ms. Cream, is there another aspect that you'd like to go to now, or have we come as far as we're going to?
We've got a couple more points and one more person we'd like to call to present some material for you.
Yes, thank you.
So I would just like to speak briefly about point 9 in our submission.
Yes.
We've asked for the area of high naturalness label to be recorded in the plan change, the proposed plan change 7, in the table of significant natural features. Now, in our submission, we address this as being in the appendix number 4 of the proposed plan change, but recently we've been unable to locate Appendix 4. It seems to have disappeared, but we would like to ask somehow that the title Area of High Naturalness is recorded in the plan document wherever there is a table of natural features, and especially that this title of naturalness, high naturalness, will ensure that the upper river is protected, and for its high level of biodiversity as well. And at this point, I would like to introduce Herman Frank, who's going to present first-hand evidence of the high biodiversity value in the upper Orari River and Gorge.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Frank. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I've chosen to do a visual presentation about the ecological and biodiversity values in the upper part of the Orari catchment. And I might just introduce myself first. You notice that I'm not born here in New Zealand. We came to New Zealand in 1992 with our family. In 1996, we moved to Timaru, and I was introduced to the Orari Gorge in 97. And since then, I have visited the Orari Gorge on many occasions, particularly in the last 12 years. I would describe myself as a naturalist, interested in all things connected with nature, but I have a particular experience in herpetology, things concerning lizards, if you want that. The Orari Gorge has received not only recent some interest. The New Zealand Wildlife Service did an inventory of what they call sites of special wildlife interest in the 1980s, and the Orari Gorge was one of those sites identified then, and it's still on the successor of that Wildlife Service, the Department of Conservation, with that label. In 2010, a landscape study, a regional landscape study was published for Canterbury. The area of Mount Peel, Four Peaks Range, was classified as an outstanding natural landscape, and in the center of that natural landscape is the Orari Gorge. That was confirmed in a just recent study for the district council, just those parts obviously in the Timaru district. The Land and Water Regional Plan has in 2016 high naturalness water bodies, and the Orari Gorge is one of those. Was the only one then, but in the Plan Change 7, another one was added to it. And so I just want to show those values again. Some have been already mentioned and alluded to, but maybe that visual presentation can add a little bit to that and highlight those biodiversity values. We have here's just a reminder. It's from the river of the gorge. The mouth of the gorge. Sorry, up to the right, the ranges, Four Peaks Range, Mount Peel, the Catchment, Usen Range, and Bin McLeod Range. The whole length of the river is about 87 kilometers, and 47 kilometers are in that upper part of the catchment. here is one of the dominant features from the plains, the Four Peaks Range in winter. And on the other side is Mount Peel, which dominates even more the landscape in the gorge. Here we are looking at the mouth of the gorge in the middle there, and already mentioned today is colonies of river birds, and we had a colony of black-billed gulls right below the gorge last year. But my focus will be on the gorge, and I have structured my presentation around the habitats we find in the gorge. And the most obvious and the most important, if you want to, is the water, is the aquatic habitat, which obviously goes right through the gorge and all the tributaries as well. And we find a relatively good quality of water there, which provides habitat for insects, freshwater insects. Here, exuvia of a stonefly, but other insects as well. So I'll show just a few examples. I can't go too much in details, that would take much too long, so I'll go through quite quickly. The native fish have been mentioned, and we find a variety of those species there. Here, an upland bully, but then obviously birds which use the river, ducks and shakes. Here a photo of a little shake resting and cleaning its feathers, and a pair of paradise ducks as well. We find other birds near the river, like a white-faced heron, kingfisher, and so forth. The most threatened species we used to have on the Orari River is the blue duck, and unfortunately that's not a photo taken on the Orari because they are gone there. The last confirmed observation was around 1997. So since then there were occasional reports, but they haven't been able to establish a population there. The habitat is still there, in my opinion, but why they disappeared is the predator pressure. And that affects, obviously, predators affect a number of other species as well. The next type of habitat we find in the gorge is those steep gorge sides, those really rocky areas, which provide a particular habitat for a set of plants. And here some side waterfalls coming in from time to time. And so we find along those edges as well certain plants which predominantly like shady and moist sites. Set of a number of ferns right through that gorge, but other plants, smaller plants, which are quite inconspicuous when they are not in flower. A parahappy here or a bittergrass here, that species is actually at-risk species, so it's one of the rarer species we find here in New Zealand. And some spots with spider orchids here, one which has finished flowering, unfortunately, growing in liverwort. The other side of the gorge, or particular outcrops, are more sun exposed, and we find different species there. Some still mosses, like you see on that photo, but then more drier vegetation, plants, and adapted to the sun more. So here is a dwarf mingi, which is not a threatened plant. It's right through the gorge and other areas in South Canterbury, but it's quite an important plant, just beautiful. The flowers attract insects. The berries, red, orange, are feed source for birds and for lizards. A more rare species is one here, stem clasping hebe, which is restricted to South Canterbury, but we have some good stands here in the Orari Gorge. It's an at-risk species. And the other typical one on those outcrops is Helichrysum, which in its name says that it likes the sun. We move on to another type of habitat which sometimes reaches down to the river edge, but often it starts on top of those outcrops, and that's regenerating bush and just bush remnants in general. So on the sides of the gorge, we have a variety of plants, trees, like here manuka in flower, kanuka, lancewood, muddybow, totara, pittosporum, and so forth, a number of other species. That photo shows an area where we have regenerating bush, that is, bush is coming back with quite a high diversity already in there, starting coprosmas, madaguri, pittosporums, but already totaras in there, young totaras growing up. So that will be, over time, will be a really valuable habitat in that part of the gorge. Some other areas are more mature bush, like here we see older kowhais, and in the middle some totaras and kahikatea growing. But you see the slopes up there all showing native vegetation. And when you go into the gorge at springtime, when the kowhai is in flower, it's just everywhere. It's just a huge feed source for insects and for birds, and it's just beautiful to observe. But there are other ones which are not so obvious when they are not in flower, but they stand out, like in early spring here, the white clematis, which is speckled right around the hillsides when it's in flower, or some yellow clematis, which that one is actually quite a rare one, at-risk species, but there are other species as well. The most threatened species, a plant species I am aware of in the gorge, and Adele alluded to that already, is the Canterbury pink broom, which is occurs in a number of spots, not many, in the gorge. It is nationally critical, and again, one of those species which are highly threatened, and the gorge is really a refuge for that species as well. Oops, sorry, I pressed one. Then in the understory or below in the shady parts, we find some orchids. Here an example, the green hooded orchid, or some other plants which only really stand out when they are in flower, because the leaves which down here of that species are just so difficult to detect. That's a Messes plant, which I personally have only found in the gorge here. Then obviously where we have that bush, we find the birds, P. waka here, the fantail, quite common in the gorge, and others, grey warbler and so forth, up to the bigger birds like the kereroo, here the wood pigeon, and one of the most obvious ones is the bellbird, which feeds on the kowhai on fuchsia, and from the pollen it got that blue face here. But then there are some more unusual birds, like the rifleman here, present in the gorge as well, and my favorite one is the shining cuckoo, It's a migrant bird which arrives here mid-October and is here sort of till end of January, and its song is regularly heard within that time period in the gorge. We have some wetlands, not that many, and that's a beautiful stand here of sedges, but many wetlands have been, or a good number of them have been drained like that in the middle here, or affected by stock by particularly cattle. If they get into those wetlands, and unfortunately they do, then obviously that wetland is not able to function as it would be otherwise. In more open areas, more the grassy areas, grasslands, there's a different set of plants in particular, and we have here still above the gorge Pimelea, which is, that particular species is at risk. And obviously insects which feed on all those plants. And I just want to show some butterflies, the copper butterflies here specifically, because in the gorge we have 4 copper butterfly species, which is quite unusual. Here's a common copper butterfly, Ropara has copper butterfly, and glade copper butterfly. And then there's also the smallest one is the boulder copperfly. There are other insects, as I alluded to here, just as an example, grasshopper. Just want to mention the tributaries to the Orari River. Here is a photo of Andrew Stream, a stream in the lower parts of the gorge, which in itself has a bit gorge character. It's a deep cut for about 2 kilometers, but you can see the biodiversity already there, and they are in all the other streams, they have various degrees of that as well. Then we have scattered throughout the gorge rocky outcrops. Here's one, and already also a photo of a plant which is quite striking when it flowers, yellow flowers in spring, and red orange berries in autumn, the Carokia. And that again is feed source for insects, the flowers, as well as then the berries for lizards and birds. In those gaps of the outcrops we can find lizards. Here's a southern Alps gecko. It's a bit difficult to see right here in one of those cracks. And they are communal lizard species, so you can find groups in one of those places. Then there's some skink species, southern grass skink, here an example, at-risk species, and McCann skink, and there is one other lizard species which is actually at risk. We travel a bit further up the gorge, still those characteristics there, as you can see, and in some places we find remnants of the original vegetation. The gorge and surrounding landscapes have been modified over the last 200 years or so, but occasionally we find remnants of the original vegetation. And here's a stand of mountain beech, an old tree. It's just amazing, those specimens, how they have survived. And there's fortunately some regeneration around those trees happening. And here's a particular slug. They are endemic to New Zealand, leaf-veined slugs, and I'm not entirely sure, because I haven't found many locations, whether they are connected to those old remnants or they're a little bit more widespread in the gorge. but I have found that one very close to that beach for remnant. Now I have shown pretty pictures. I hope you consider them pretty, but we have alluded a few times to issues in the gorge. We have shown, and the film is picked up as well, predators which have affected some species quite heavily, like the blue duck, but others, lizards, have been affected as well, and the birds. So the predator program is the Orari protection group does is really helping those species, but there are weeds as well right through the gorge: broom, gorse, Himalayan honeysuckle, alder along the river, and more. So, as Adele mentioned, we have the group has done quite a considerable number of hours to help and get rid of those weeds just to protect those habitats. And again, Adele mentioned it, that through the immediate steps has helped and supported the group in that endeavor. There are some challenging areas, as you can see, where it's difficult to access, but if we don't do those areas, we have a continuing weed source. I want to talk only very briefly about higher altitude values. Bruce Allen has mentioned about the short tussock lands and high tussock lands, but they have also different plants associations and different animals living in those. Some are similar, like lower down here, native jasmine, which goes right up to the shrub and tree level. Mount Peel in the background here. A spear grass is one of the examples there. We have other birds which prefer that more open environment. Here, New Zealand pipit, threatened species, at-risk species as well. Or in the gorge, the New Zealand falcon here, female. On most occasions when I'm in the gorge, I can at least hear one of the falcons calling. So that is, again, at-risk species, which we still have in the Orari Gorge. Just to show you, there are some other aspects which I don't know a lot about, lichens and other plants, but it's just a colorful reminder that they are there as well. In some parts we find particular vegetation, like here, Maori onion, which is not so common in the gorge, but in some of the tributaries. Further up the gorge, the landscape gets a bit more open and more, maybe not quite so dramatic, but right through those 16 kilometers we find high biodiversity, different habitats, high ecological values. And so that's from that photo from up there. So I just want to summarize what I wanted to bring across. Orari Gorge with Mount Peel and Four Peaks has a high assemblage of different landforms. It has very few signs of human intervention. It provides a sense of remoteness, and it has a high degree of naturalness. At least 11 plants are in the Orari Gorge and the catchment are at risk, and at least one plant is nationally critical. Of the birds, 3 are threatened and 2 are at risk, and lizards, 2 species are at risk, which occur in the gorge. What are the issues which can affect those values, and some we have heard about? It's intensification. The current land use has or in the past has mostly conserve those values, but intensification will change the habitats and which in consequence will affect the plants and the animals living there. Changes in land use altogether, like forestry, obviously a completely type of habitat, if you can describe that as a habitat. Human-made structures like tracks, buildings, in some cases even fences, if they are sort of in places where they just affect that visual aspect. As I said at the beginning, the Plan Change 7 has acknowledged the Orari upper catchment as a high natural water body, and we support that and ask that it be retained. Also the characteristics in Plan Change 7 there, but I think we should add, and I hope my talk has provided enough information for that, that the Orari River, the Orari Gorge, has high ecological and biodiversity values. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Dr. Frank,
Yeah,
how
I'm not a
fortunate
doctor.
we are. You've chosen to come here to remind us of these. It's been an outstanding reminder of the range of natural life in the Orari Gorge area, and a splendid presentation. Thank you.
Most
Do
welcome.
my colleagues have any questions of Dr. Frank?
No, none from me, thank you.
No, none from me either, thank you.
Well, thank you again. We've really found that very informative.
So I know that you have a lot to do, Commissioners, and you've got a lot more people to hear from and to make your big decisions, but I would just like to make a few closing comments, if that's okay, from our group.
Thank you.
I would like to speak to point 10 in our submission. I provided a number of reports there from the hearings for the Te Waikoropupu Springs up in Tākaka. The reason I presented those to you as evidence is because when the hearing heard the evidence that was presented, they decided to adopt a precautionary approach. And there was this, in Dr. Graham Fenwick's evidence, he suggested a trigger value of 0.4 or 0.5 milligrams per litre of nitrates just as a precautionary value to ensure ecosystem health. What I would like to suggest, or we as a group, is that the Orari River, with its high biodiversity and its clean water, is such a valuable river, especially in its upper catchment. There are not many places left like this in Canterbury with clean water and this level of biodiversity. So we would like to ask that this plan does all it can to protect the upper catchment of the Orari River. We noted that the Commissioners have reported in the Section 42A report that you did not see that it was appropriate to include the the high naturalness in the gorge and to protect the upper river from further intensification. But we would like to ask you, is there another place, or is there a place that you can find in the plan that you can use this plan to protect this river and to stop further intensification in the upper Orari catchment? I don't know if you could answer that, but I'd like to wait if you feel like answering that.
Well, no, we're not here to
No.
speak to you.
No.
We're listening to what
All
you
right.
say to us.
Well, thank you for listening. And I'd just like to say, as my final point on behalf of our group, that humans are resourceful and we are adaptable and we can find other ways to grow food and provide livings for our families and our communities. But with the pressure that we've put on our wildlife, it's clear that our declining native species are not as resilient and that they need our utmost protection. And so I would like to just ask you all on our behalf if you could find a way to use this plan to protect this river and other rivers like it. That would be just incredible. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Coombe, you've gone to a lot of trouble in designing and preparing and presenting your submission this afternoon, and we're aware that there are many others who have been helping you, but You're the leader, and so you get the thanks. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Now, is Mr. Connolly here?
Yes, he's there.
Yes, I thought we might just manage to provide for him too. Here's Ms. Hornsey.
Good
Now-
afternoon, Commissioners, and thank you very much for accommodating this late appearance by Mr. Connolly. As the panel will be aware, he was unable to attend yesterday in support of the submission by the Orakipaoa Water Users Group. But he would now like to take this opportunity to introduce himself and talk very briefly about his involvement with the Orakipaoa area.
Yes. Well, that's just fine. Mr. Connolly, we were sorry you weren't able to be with us previously, and we're grateful that you've taken the trouble to come now to speak to us, and please do.
Thank you, Commissioner. My name's Simon Connolly from Orakipaoa Farms Limited, and with my wife and 2 children, we own a farm in Milford. My family have been crop farmers at that location for 52 years, growing carrots and potatoes for processing, specialist seeds, radish, spinach and brassicas, wheat and barley. All of our crops are contracted on a contract to grow basis, and a lot of these contracts are subject to be able to supply, and we need the water to be able to do so. I know that David Lister spoke to you yesterday, so I won't go over any of that. I'd just like to speak to paragraph 8 of our introduction. Our water users group worked together with the ZAPA committee. We're disappointed that we weren't consulted, that our creek was going to be put under high natural significance. We weren't consulted, and I'm getting a bit lost here, but not very well prepared. So I want to sort of speak a wee bit about our creek and our farming practices. It's all about relationships for us. I went to school with a lot of the guys who are from Arawhenua. I played sport with them, I fished with them. We know each other, we talk about things. And as far as I can see, they weren't consulted, and we don't really know what we're looking after. And we take great pride in our area and some of the land we look after and some of the history there. Just the other day we received a card from a couple and their family that were travelling throughout the South Island. Their ancestors had lived in the area, and we know the history of the area, so we showed them round, and they wrote us a small card to say thank you, and it's got, "Thank you very much for allowing my family and I to view the Pearse site." It was, put my glasses back on. It was very special for us. In fact, it has been on my bucket list for years. And we run an open gate policy to anyone who wants to come and collect eels or watercress or use our waterways. And all as we ask is to know what we're protecting and how important the water is to our farming operation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Connolly. Any questions for Mr. Connolly? Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Just one from me. Because you know some of the whānau from Arawhenua, did you talk to them about this?
I've talked to Luke Rahana a little about it, but we were unaware until the plan came out that it was written, that it was well, we classed it ourselves as high natural significance, but we didn't even know it was there until the plan was introduced.
So did the whānau from Arawhenua not know either?
I don't think so.
Thank you, that's all from me.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming in, Mr. Connolly. And is there anything further on the Orakipaoa Water Users Week that you would wish to address us on, Ms. Hornsey?
No, there's not, but just again, thank you for the opportunity of allowing Mr. Connolly to come along today.
Very well. Thank you. Well, that finishes our business for today, and we'll sit again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and I think we have the Pihi or Puha catchment group then. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Yes, that's correct.